The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of the Benjamin Dixon Show. Obviously, not Benjamin Dixon. This is Anoa Changa, hostess with the mostest, filling in for the big bro today. It's been quite some time since I got to talk to the Benjamin Dixon Show audience. How you guys doing? Miss you all lots. Hope you do get to check me out on The Way with Anoa, available on Spreaker and iTunes and YouTube and all the other fabulous places you find Ben. You'll find me there too. So much going on, right? Like here we are, it's almost April. Can you believe we're almost in April? 2018 is just like, it's like, dude, why are you, slow down? Why are you in such a rush? Or maybe we want it to be in a rush so we can get away from, the Trump is resistance and Trump issues and all that other stuff going on. It's so much madness in the world. However, Roseanne is back on the air. Yay. I mean, who isn't excited? Roseanne, the white working class has representation on TV again. My heart be still. No, seriously though. Used to love Roseanne as a kid. Very much identified with the Darlene character, right? But the thing about Roseanne, the internets are raving about, how the white working class is representation again on TV. I did not know that white people had a representation issue in terms of the media. That's really interesting to hear. Tell me more about that. But seriously, though, I think we need to recognize that it's not that the problem with Roseanne and her framing, right, and her own personal politics cannot be separated from the character that she plays on the show and the platform that she is being given. We are at a time where, people are acting like, we actually have a Georgia legislator here who's like, oh, we need to, represent conservatives on campus. Conservatives should have a conservative space on campus so that they can go talk about conservative issues. Like literally no one is stopping people from expressing their viewpoints. You all literally have control over our government on the federal level and in so many spaces, at the state level as well. So this idea that people don't have a voice or representation is very fascinating to me, right? I think that when we're looking at, representation and we're looking at these issues in spaces like television, these mediums, this notion that we have to be balanced and provide, opportunity for all is really interesting considering, the lengths that they go to provide opportunity and what spaces that happens in, right? Like we're not making sure that we're having very radical perspectives and the issues around Roseanne. And like I mentioned, there's the Georgia legislator here who wants to have if LGBTQ folks are allowed to have a center or space that they can go to for support, then why can't conservatives? And the show Grownish is a spinoff of Blackish. If you haven't checked out Blackish on ABC, like that used to be my show, but it has some issues. Grownish, I was really excited to see that. It follows the oldest daughter, Zoe, as she goes to college in her first year. And so it's kind of like this generation's A Different World in a way, except for she's a much more interesting character than Elisa Bonet's. Denise was on A Different World. That's a whole other story. But this issue, and I'm getting to it, is that this notion that everyone deserves a space, everyone deserves a voice, kind of that participation trophy mentality, when applied by conservatives is really interesting. And they had an episode about safe spaces. And there was a protest happening on campus in the show Grownish. And, everyone's all excited. And one of the characters is a Latina. And so the friend group, mistakenly thinks that her questions and her discussions about when she's talking about my people, they all incorrectly assume she means Latinx, people. And she's like, no, I mean conservatives, because she's a part of some Republican women's group or something like that, some conservative women's group. And like everyone's face just totally shifts. because they already shared with her the tools about protests and how to get a permit and stuff. But she wants a safe space for conservatives on campus. And this idea that conservatives need a safe space, this idea that, you know, the white working class is not being represented, that they're left behind or left out, like, that's really actually rooted in something completely different, though, right? It's not that, you know, people in their entrenched thinking should have representation and have that reinforced and validated. It's that there are systems and mechanisms that exist within a society. And this is where we get into how can we both, you know, reach working class people regardless of race, right? Because, I mean, there's often a discussion, there's a hyper focus on the white working class, since that is a voter base that has dwindled, particularly for, you know, Democrats and the quote unquote left over the last, you know, several years, past few decades. But so how do we, you know, one, get people to start talking about the working class as a voting bloc? Because the working class has a common shared values and interests, right? But then also, then how do we also, these other particular constituency groups like, you know, Latino voters, Black voters, et cetera, how do we balance that? And there was a really dope piece recently in the, I think it was in the New Republic, that looked at this and how Democrats, I mean, essentially is what many of us have been arguing over the past almost 3 years now, we saw the rise of Bernie Sanders and the new wave of this progressive movement moment, that we need to be talking about issues that actually matter to people. And that was something that was touched on last night. I was down at Fort Valley State, had a chance to hear Angela Rye speak about activism and action. I know a lot of folks are like, oh, well, you know, her politics don't go far enough. There are a lot of people whose politics don't go far enough. There are a lot of people who share spaces with us. And, you know, their politics do not go, do not go far enough. But I think that there are some things that we can learn from people, even if we don't think their politics go far enough, even if we don't actually agree specifically with their politics. There's still something in the message, I think, that we can take away with it. One thing I took away from her and what she did for students last night was help them see that they have the potential to make a difference. And a lot of times we're all excited about students and the millennials and stuff like that. But a lot of folks ignore HBCUs, Black students, Black millennials, Latino students, Latino millennials. Like, we need to be doing better about talking to you about issues and helping them understand that they really actually do have the power to make change. And that's not just some, oh, I have a dream and we can all do this, kumbaya stuff. That's real. Like, every time the kids asked her a question last night, college students, I shouldn't call them kids, they asked her a question last night, she kind of reversed it. She walked them through a problem-solving exercise. It was pretty cool, actually, to watch, because I haven't really actually seen people do this before. They asked a question like, how do you do this? Or how if I wanted to do this? Or how politically do I do this? And like, they were talking about issues from, you know, Black wealth, which I know Nick and I had a discussion about whether or not Black banking will really actually help change the condition of Black wealth in America. That's a whole nother topic. But it's still interesting the way she handled the kids. And what she would do is, you know, for the sister that asked about Black wealth and another young sister asked about, felony restoration of votes, she flipped it on them, you know, started asking them questions, helped them, you know, work through a quick problem solving exercise. Like, you're talking about a policy issue. Like, how do we address policy? We got to lobby our legislator. How do we lobby? Who do we talk to? And so what she did is she asked the audience who else was interested in that topic. The person who asked the question basically got made, you know, the facilitator of a committee, and then those kids got grouped together. So it was really dope. Activism in action, like in the midst of her question and answer session, that I really appreciated. And I think that there are steps tools that we can see from people, you know, whether we agree with them. We can disagree with people on the substance of what they're saying, but there are strategies and ways that people are going about doing things that are helpful, that can help us really move the needle. And that was something that I really appreciated. And it made me think about this conversation that's happening nationwide about campuses and speech. You know, we have bills pending right now in Georgia that's looking to restrict speech in particular ways that would actually, you know, they're so concerned about protecting free speech, but really what we're seeing with this protection of free speech is a way of limiting those who actually oppose systems of white supremacy, who are looking to actually dismantle the system that's oppressive for so many. And so when we're talking about trying to appeal to the white working class or representing the white working class, I really feel like we need to be looking at this from a very different lens than simply giving someone a bullhorn or a platform without any type of context or analysis for the conditions within which they're living, for any real type of couching the issue within something that is recognizable by the masses, right? As a real critique and conversation. It's not just simply like, here's your life. It's okay that you hate people. It's okay that you do this because you're poor and we understand this. Yes, we do need to work for and acknowledge those issues. But we also need to work on helping to educate and uplift people instead of just simply enabling them in the space that they're in. And so that was just something that I was thinking about this morning as I was getting started. And because that type of stuff really actually directly relates to, if we're not challenging people's mentalities and thought on issues and how things break down, Democrats will snidely say, oh, those people vote against their interests, but you're not actually collectively building and working and engaging people to help them uplift their interests, right? Their mindset on some of these issues. At the same time, you're refusing to do what people need done, right? All the people who are scoffing at healthcare reform, Medicare for all, or even just Medicaid, like Medicaid expansion. I know, guys, Medicaid expansion is not the end all be all, but it's a step in the right direction, particularly if you're someplace like down in the South, like me, where Medicaid expansion is not even a reality. And there's so many people who are uninsured or underinsured who would otherwise benefit. Two of those women are in my own family, my mother and my sister. So there's a lot to continue challenging, whether you're on the inside or on the outside. They keep trying to drag me inside, y'all. They're trying to drag me in. And I'm just like, ooh, I can't go on the dark side. I can't do it. Oh, you do so much good here. No, nope. I got to stay on the outside. So it's interesting. And when we think about the mentality and our failure to challenge mentalities that are actually destructive overall to further advancement society-wise, right? We look at the verdict in the Alton-Sterling case. The verdict in Alton-Sterling just happened. Well, not verdict. I misspoke because I'm thinking about juries. I'm jumping ahead of myself. But the decision to not bring charges. A lot of folks have been talking about this since the decision came down yesterday. But one thing, I was talking this through with my mother, my godmother, who is a criminal defense attorney by trade, civil rights attorney, done amazing work in Chicago around some of the John Burge cases. Like, she's a phenomenal woman. But we were talking through, because I am a member of the National Lawyers Guild, and I was reading through the report from the Department of Justice in Louisiana. I was reading through their report about why they did not bring charges. And what was really interesting, I was saying to her, is like the mental gymnastics that prosecutors use to not bring charges against police officers. And she stopped me. She said, well, for them, it's not mental gymnastics because there is a de facto reasonable fear of Black men that is recognized as being legitimate. So police officers getting the benefit of the doubt exists in their worldview. They don't have to do mental gymnastics. To us, in our worldview, it is mental gymnastics. It is obscene and absurd. And when you're reading through things, and what really struck me was that the standard for bringing charges was whether or not the charges, the facts beyond a reasonable doubt, could lead to a conviction. And it's so interesting because in no other situation, most other people, if they're not, unless you're an officer or you're a law enforcement officer adjacent person, as we're seeing happening right now in Jacksonville, with DJ Brodus, like, unless you're somehow connected to the justice system in that way, like you're related to an officer or something like that, you don't get this level of consideration in terms of reasonable doubt. I mean, because prosecutors bring charges, indict people, charge people all the time on the weakest of evidence. And to say that it returned on the facts when so much of what prosecutors do is based on conjecture and argument and supposition, it was really interesting to me. And so it led to in our conversation this morning, we were just talking about how there is always, doubt when it comes to a Black man. So, like, is there a reasonable doubt that this could happen, or beyond a reasonable doubt? But when we're talking about police officers get this this extreme sense of deference and benefit of the doubt, so that we're going to more than likely not have this outcome. And no, I'm not saying that we should just be resolved that this is what's always going to happen. But this is why the push for, one, prosecutors who are either willing to have a different worldview or have a different worldview. And then we also need juries, because here's the other thing, like, and reading this report, the prosecutor is thinking about whether or not just that, they could make a case, but whether or not beyond a reasonable doubt, a conviction would come back. Imagine, when you think about all the people who have been wrongfully convicted, the shaky evidence and stuff in trials, like, basically what they're acknowledging without acknowledging is that the subtext of all of this is that there is an accepted standard of reasonableness in terms of, marginalized people and their criminality. And in this case, Black men and their threat, right? Like, we exist in a world where that is not our reality. We don't automatically see Black men as threatening. Some people may, and some people may have, good reason in their minds for thinking so, but like, that doesn't make sense to most of us, and it's mental gymnastics. However, when you look at, Supreme Court jurisprudence, when you look at, the case law and what has been deemed reasonable, like I was speaking, and I was speaking on a panel recently at Georgia Tech, and we was talking about the fact that, there's case law when you talk about, reasonable searches and seizures and stops and things of that nature that basically say that if you're in, I remember a case from criminal procedure in law school, and, that the DC police, it was reasonable for them to stop two men. I think they were driving like a BMW or whatever, and it was late at night, two Black men in a BMW, because what else? Like, it's an expensive car, so what else could they have been doing? Was basically the line of reasoning in the case. And because it's DC and there's high drug trafficking area, blah, blah, blah. And so that type of rationalization exists within the system, right? It has been legally enshrined into the system that we have. And so when you have prosecutors who are cultivated and encouraged and nurtured and supported in this system with that mindset, that is how they approach cases, right? So then we get to the instance where we want charges brought against a cop. It's not going to happen unless there's a really egregious, and not to say that what happened to Alton-Sterling, what happened in so many of these cases, Philando Castile, so many of these cases is not egregious. But as we saw with the series of events that led up to the charges in Walter Scott's murder, right? Like, that was extremely egregious. There was no room for, like, the lies, just all of that. Just, there was no way that they could get around not charging him. And it's those scenarios that seem to be the only ones. And I know a lot of us think, well, of course, there's so many cases that are like that. But that one and those facts in the Walter Scott trial case, like, were so, like, of such a level, there was no way they could finagle out of it. And that's what you really see when you read the rationalization and why they don't bring charges in so many of these cases. They're really finagling and rationalizing and twisting and turning to get out of bringing charges. And somehow we have to, culturally, we have to work on having prosecutors who don't have Black men as a symbol of fear, who don't have that default standard, right? The report also talks about, like, how there was no premeditated intent. Now, understand that when you bring charges for someone's death, there are, like, multiple inclusive offenses under the charge of murder, right? I know y'all watch Law and Order. They sometimes get it right, they sometimes don't. But so there are multiple. So there's manslaughter. There's there's manslaughter. There's voluntary manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter. There's murder 1, murder 2. There's so many different gradations. There are charges that can be brought if it's an accident. So there is a large range of charges. I can't remember the BART officer who killed Oscar Brown. Like, I can't remember what his charge was, but I remember it was something lesser than even manslaughter. So like, there's a huge range of possibility, right? Prosecutors, this illustrates, these cases illustrate the wide discretion and some of the issues and challenges with prosecutorial discretion that we have to address and deal with and grapple with. And The other side, the flip side in terms of a jury, right? So the assumption that a jury, because it's reasonable in America to believe that black men are inherently dangerous and that killing black men, even when they're in innocuous situations, when they're not doing everything, is reasonable and fine. So how do we break through that? How do we break through that? How do we break through that when we have a show like Roseanne glorifying people in their ignorance and saying it's okay because you're working class and you're working so hard that you hold these other values? Like, we have an inconsistency in the culture right now that has to be addressed. And having an economics class-based analysis only will not do that. And before anyone say, well, literally no one has economics class-based analysis only, that's totally not true. So many folks do. We got to move on. We can do it both. We can do it all. We need to approach it. But this is where organizing, this is where really getting involved at the community level really comes in, because we have to start changing the nature of the way people think and breathe and live. Otherwise, we're not going to see real movement, because not only do we need to do that, but we need prosecutors who understand that we need prosecutors who aren't afraid of the cops. We need prosecutors who already don't give cops this ultimate level of deference in what they're doing. We see so many countless cases. Yes, okay, there are good officers out there, blah, blah, blah. Good officers don't undo the bad from bad ones. And in fact, when they're silent, so many people have already said this, when they're silent, they're only further damaging their own credibility and quote unquote goodness, right? So, but we also need people to serve on juries. And for the most part, like registering to vote, and I know folks are like, okay, voting doesn't matter, blah, blah, blah. But when you register to vote, that makes you eligible to serve as a juror. And if we don't have more people like us who are available to be called up for that possibility, because that's the other thing, right? We can have charges brought, but if a jury is willing to give cops that same level of deference, if they're willing to go through what we view as mental gymnastics, but for them is this ultimate level of deference because their life and interaction with police is very different from ours. I mean, we're still facing that same problem, right? So there's a lot that needs to happen. And I think that as we look at this Alton-Sterling decision, we need to start reevaluating our approach to this issue and how we're looking at, there are the efforts to get different DAs elected, especially we saw the success of Larry Krasner in Philly, which, if anybody's from Philly, I would love to talk more about what's happening there. I know Sean King had a piece talking about how revolutionary his actions are. I really want to know from folks who are on the ground, who are working and engaged in that space, is that actually as revolutionary as it's being portrayed? But we do need to be moving in that direction. And part of that is we need to get new people elected. If you're someplace where your prosecutors are elected, we do need to be encouraging, supporting people to run, and then also holding them accountable once they're in office. Like, we have this wave of progressives nationwide, but we gotta help support people once we get them in there, right? We can't just be like, okay, our job's done, problem solved, because people need that support. Because if we don't support them, trust and believe, moneyed interests and other folks in power will put their hands on them. And if we expect people to be that line of defense against those other interests, we have to be there to have their backs, ready to hold the line with them. And I just so that's kind of where I was at. And that brings me, to something that I just recently discussed with Michael Brooks on the Michael Brooks Show. Shout out to somebody else who's pretty dope and awesome and gives me space and platform. But, like all this talk and discussion, I mean, this is not new. When I was at a retreat in October for the National Conference of Black Lawyers, which I sit on the board of, it's celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. And we did an exercise of the decades, for when people became of age as lawyers and got involved and stuff. And so, obviously being a younger attorney, I'm in the 2000 range. But when you see the folks who came in the 60s, right, and you see the issues they were talking about in the 60s and 70s across the last 50 years, there are cycles. We're talking about the same thing. So we're talking about police brutality and prosecution of cases now. That's the same thing in varying forms that they were dealing with in the 60s and 70s and 80s. We're seeing an increase in uptick in surveillance. Like, let's be clear, surveillance of activists have never gone away. We just have an uptick in activism. So, of course, we're having an increase in surveillance. You have the creation of the BIE, the black-identity-extremists, which actually the CBC actually held a hearing recently on the BIE designation and report and stuff, and testimony from there were two former FBI officers actually who testified. Let me see if I can find the quote here. But what we're seeing is a redux of what has already happened before. Like, again, this is not new. We are in a cycle, and I really feel like that we are in a 68 moment. And so this quote from the press release about this hearing that happened was, so it's the CBC Task Force on Foreign Affairs and National Security. They hosted a briefing looking at the black-identity-extremists report from the FBI. And what this quote was just so interesting. One of the FBI officers, Michael German, said, the assessment is of such poor analytic quality that it raises serious questions about the FBI's purpose in producing it. What is most troubling about the BIE assessment is its potential to incite irrational police fear of Black political activists. Irrational fear, unfortunately, too often in the past translated into unnecessary police violence against unarmed and unthreatening Black men and women. And we've seen this happening over the years. This is basically the extent of our existence in the United States of America. We've seen irrational fear dictating action, state action against us, and state sanctioned action in protecting those who also move against us. And I'll make sure that Ben has the link if anyone wants to check out the hearing. But I was thinking about it because I'm thinking about this. When we think about the 60s, and people have said this before, this level of activism engagement that we're having now is so reminiscent of times past, right? And I really feel like, and it's something I learned in a sociology class, like movements happen in waves. Like they're always going on, but there are these spikes in activism. We've been seeing that over the last several years. Bree Newsom tweeted out this morning that there have been massive urban uprisings happening over the last few years, similar to the 60s, right? We saw an increase in uprisings and activity leading up and culminating in 68. And I feel like we're in a similar moment of synergy and activism. And there's so many lessons for us to learn from the past. And we have so much at our fingertips right now that I think that when the next 50-year reflection happens, we will have seen a massive shift in engagement and attitude and action. I mean, I already feel like there's been somewhat of a shift, but in some ways we're still relitigating some of the same fights that our predecessors were going through 50 years ago. And I'm really hopeful that we're able to put something in place so that in 50 years, our children aren't relitigating the same battles yet once again. But I talked about this we saw recently about the FBI. I think there was an Intercept article talking about the FBI and increased surveillance of Black activists, which is part of my concern when people started latching onto, oh my God, the Russians are influencing Black Lives Matter from the whole Russia hysteria stuff. And I wrote a piece about that, short piece in The Nation, because we need to be really careful. Because when you start labeling things divisive, right? When you start labeling people and their work divisive, and the FBI, has always looked at, revolutionary activism, radical politics as something that threatens the existence of the United States of America. And when we're talking about, revolution and change, and I mean, people really need to understand what we're talking about here, because what you're talking about is threatening the existence of this country as it has existed. When we're talking about dismantling white supremacy, we're talking about something that is considered technically a threat to this government because it requires a fundamental shift and change in existing base of power. And that's a threat. So as long as we're pushing for these changes, and as long as we're doing this, we're always going to be considered by the FBI. So when people, I'm pretty sure none of Ben's listeners, and if you're any of mine, I'm sure none of you are the ones that are like, oh my God, the FBI, we have to support them. No, we have to demand accountability and push back all the time, because as we're seeing, it doesn't matter whether this is happening now under the idiot in charge of the DOJ. We have seen increased activism happening under, former President Obama and two Black heads of the DOJ, right? Because ultimately, it doesn't matter whether we have brown or Black faces in high places if they're still ultimately responding to the base one level of protecting the United States of America and its interests, even if that means against those of us who reside within this country. And so as we think about the 68 moment, as we think about where we are now, I really believe that we are in our own 68, this is 68 2.0. And there are so many lessons, and there's a synergy and amazing critical mass of activism, organizing, and just really brilliant thought happening right now and coming from so many sectors. And we need to continue to build on it. Yes, there are issues. No one's perfect. Nobody's a perfect progressive. Nobody's a perfect leftist. We need to find a way to work through and criticize and critique with honesty and love instead of just spiteful, I'm right and you're wrong. Because that doesn't help inspire and move people to action. And we need to be looking at how do we build to win? How do we build the organizing front support that we need to win? Check out Marshall Ganz's article in The Nation from 2 weeks ago, paraphrasing the title, Organizing to Win. But this is the bread and butter. This is the good stuff. And so we have the opportunity, we have the resources, we have, the connections, the ideas. And this is something I've been talking about since day one from joining Progressive Army and been on this journey. We need to get in where we can and raise our voices and leverage platforms in a way that helps uplift our common agendas and goals. And not simply just trashing or bagging on Democrats or whomever, right? Because that doesn't inspire people to action. That don't feed people. That don't help change the condition in our schools. Yes, they're wrong. Okay, what are we going to do about it as an alternative? And that's where I'm going to leave that today. So appreciate you guys for listening. You can catch me on Twitter at The Way with Anoa. You can catch me on Spreaker, iTunes, my stuff posts to YouTube. Hit me up on Facebook. Oh, and your girl is doing Georgia policy and analysis at thepeachperspective.com. So this has been another edition of the Benjamin Dixon Show. I definitely appreciate you all. Like, subscribe on Ben's pages. You know the drill, and talk to you soon.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.